And I want to welcome you back to another Race Talk Revolution episode, Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. This is the place where your voice matters. And our speakers today are Mr. Silas Kulkarni and Mr. John Wood Jr. of Braver Angels, America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to political depolarization. Today, they will share how Braver Angels is working to bridge the partisan divide in politics and race. Now, welcome to all the new people here on Race Talk Revolution. And as always, during our conversation today, we ask that you please remain muted. When we get to the Q&A section, we will instruct you on how to raise your hand. Now, during that time, we will invite you to activate your camera and express your questions and comments to your speakers, to the speakers. Also, during that Q&A, and I'm going to say it again during that time, is we want to keep our questions and or comments to a minute or less, because I know we're going to have a lot of people who are going to be asking questions on this beautiful episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. But until then, we ask that you please give them your full attention and limit your use of the chat as much as possible. We also would like to remind you that Race Talk Revolution is an inclusive platform. It is a loving, inclusive platform designed to strip away the false beliefs that keep us separated as a species, uncover the not so hidden truth that we all truly do want the same things in life, and to heal the wounds created by systemic racism. Race Talk Revolution is a safe and brave space for people of all backgrounds to share ideas and opinions and explore the nuances of systemic racism, while together we are growing our capacity for effective anti-racist activism. The Race Talk Revolution community is committed to practicing radically inclusive love. Practicing radically inclusive love. So what do we mean by that? If you do not understand or agree with what's being shared, we ask that you listen with respect, listen with appreciation and empathy. You see, it is our commitment that every person be encouraged, heard, and appreciated, because here on Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, every voice matters. Now here's my co-host, the beautiful Lane Cobb.
Thanks, Eugene. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. We're so excited to have Mr. Silas Kulkarni and Mr. John Wood Jr. with us today, and I get to introduce them, and then we will be starting the conversation. Mr. Silas Kulkarni is a leader within the Braver Angels community, where he served as Senior Fellow for Public Discourse. Before becoming a Braver Angel, Silas co-founded and served as Executive Director of Teaching Lab, an educational equity nonprofit. Teaching Lab was based on Silas's years of work as a record-breaking teacher and advocate for low-income and minority students. Mr. John Wood Jr. is a writer, podcaster, and noted public speaker, nationally recognized as a leading voice on issues of political and racial reconciliation. He is a national ambassador for Braver Angels, which is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to political depolarization. Mr. Kulkarni and Mr. Wood, welcome to Race Talk Revolution. We're so happy to have you.
It's a joy to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
You are welcome. It is an honor. I've been wanting to talk to you guys for a long time. Can one of you please give us a brief history of Braver Angels before we get going, for people who don't know about your organization?
John, do you want me to give the 2-second one and then you can fill in details that I don't know?
I'm happy to follow your lead, Silas.
Braver Angels was founded in the wake of the 2016 election. Following the divisiveness of that election, a small group of Trump supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters decided to gather to have a conversation facilitated by some of our colleagues at Braver Angels, the co-founders, Mr. David Blankenhorn, Mr. Bill Doherty, and Mr. David Lapp. They brought them together and had this conversation where they were able to transcend the acrimony of that election in a way that none of them had ever experienced before, leading to deep friendships among some of them and a desire to continue working together. And that started a movement that grew from just that initial workshop to literally chapters in all 50 states, workshops going constantly, and over 15,000 members as I last counted. John could tell you a lot more about that history. He lived more of it than I did, but that is the basic story of how it launched and how it's grown over time. John, anything you want to add?
Yeah, now, I myself was also not present at the founding. So Silas and I came in sort of the second generation, if you will, of activists and leaders within Braver Angels. But that initial workshop took place, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'd have been in a barn in South Lebanon, Ohio. And in particular, it produced a friendship that wound up being very well covered in the mainstream press between a former small town sheriff, evangelical Christian construction worker, Trump supporter named Greg Smith, and an Iranian immigrant who was also a leader of the local Democratic County Party named Kuyar Mustafshi. And in the midst of that workshop, which actually extended over the course of 3 days, that initial program, and keep in mind, Braver Angels, originally founded as Better Angels, was not an organization at that point. David and Bill just had the idea to see if people could still come together and recognize common humanity, not agree on the politics, but recognize common humanity across the divide after the Trump-Clinton election. And in the course of one of those conversations, Greg Smith wanted to voice his opposition to Islam. And so he began to make a point by saying that I can describe my problem with Islam in 4 letters, I, and before he could put the last I on the end of it, Kuyar gently interjected and said, "My friend, I know what you're going to say." But then he said, "But my religion has been hijacked by people who don't share my values." He said, "Can you think of people who have hijacked your religion, possibly, who don't share what you believe?" And of course, it wasn't difficult for Greg to think of folks who burn crosses in the name of Jesus and, called themselves Christian. And when Greg heard that, it gave him cause to reflect. And so at the end of the workshop, Greg and Kuyar stood up and made an announcement to the group. They pledged each of them to continue working to build bridges of understanding, and they each committed to do so, starting with one another's faith communities. Kuyar made a commitment to come and visit for a service at Greg's church, and David made a commitment to come and visit for a service at Kuyar's mosque. And so that is an example of the sort of relationship that the sort of model of interaction has produced from the beginning. That particular story and the story of that workshop got picked up by NPR. And following that, the founders embarked on a bus tour across a number of eastern and maybe southern states, where they seeded Braver Angels workshops in local communities, almost like first responders. People were calling saying, "Hey, my neighborhood, my community, my school, we can't talk, we can't get along, help us navigate these divides." But in holding these workshops in the different places, the original Better Angels crew, then called Better Angels, also were training volunteers to continue to produce these workshops and encounters after the bus pulled out of town. And that became the beginning of our volunteer and membership community. So, but as they say, the rest is history.
Thank you. And let me just tell people that I put that story of that first meeting and those 2 people that you referenced can be seen in the video that I just posted in the chat on YouTube, Braver Angels Reuniting America. It's really, it's definitely worth a watch, particularly if you're interested in how this got going. I wanted to talk about the focus on depolarization politically and also racially because I know now there's been a little bit of a shift because the original focus was on political depolarization, if I'm correct. So to tell me a little bit about the shift now to include depolarization around race, and then I've got a couple of follow-up questions. Well, let me just ask this, and each of you probably might have a different answer. Why do you feel like America has become so polarized in general, and what does race have to do with that?
Well, so to take the question about Braver Angels focus first for a moment, I think that it's certainly fair to say that, particularly in the aftermath of George Floyd, I think that we have sought to be more conscientious and more intentional in terms of opening the space for the delicate and difficult racial conversations that the nation as a whole has had to and needs to reckon with in deep and substantive terms, and to work that into our programming more explicitly. And now I should mention the fact that Braver Angels activity covers a range of things. Of course, we have workshop models and interventions, and some of our programming is tailored directly to facilitating Black-white conversations, cross-cultural conversations, even racial conversations between white people, because that's an area of communication that we have deemed worthy of cultivation as well. But also in the context of podcasts, media material, our Braver Angels debates program, we've sought to go much deeper in these topics than had been the case early on. And in part, that's facilitated by a larger expansion in our programming as well. So we have more tools these days. But even having said that, at that very first workshop I just described, there was some conversation about racial matters too. I don't think it predominated. It was a largely white group. But it is to say that there's no understanding of American polarization, no realistic understanding of it, that doesn't include racial dynamics at the heart of it, I think. And so to your question, and I'll be curious to hear Silas's answer, but why are we polarized in the way that we are now? There are, of course, many reasons for that, having to do with the change of partisan culture, having to do with technology and social media. I think one key piece, though, that I like to point to is the fact that American society is more diverse now than it has been in decades past. And it's important, I think, to understand that diversity, not just in terms of the aggregate sort of demographic spread of American society. Yes, we have many more immigrants, including in particular immigrants from South and Latin America. Yes, but of course, many other places as well. Yes, the sort of white and particularly sort of like Anglo sort of historically majority and, so to speak, mainstream culture of American society is now increasingly moving towards being a plurality. But that diversity also shows up in American institutions. It shows up in the academy. It shows up in the entertainment industry. It shows up in government and in schools locally. And part of what that means as people of color sort of rise in the ranks, so to speak, in American society, is that narratives of American experience and understandings of American history and identity that in many respects will inevitably challenge some traditional understandings of American history and identity, can come into conflict with those sort of conventional or traditional storylines. Now, that's not to render a judgment on who's right or who's wrong. It's simply to observe the fact that in places where a certain way of looking at things has predominated historically, that is no longer unquestioningly the case. And so this creates the context for friction, misunderstanding, but also hopefully for communication, empathy, and growth. But we have to be intentional about cultivating that as well if the positive potential of these conversations is to come to pass.
Thanks for sharing that, John. And for the audience who doesn't know, one of the things that's intentional to the design of Braver Angels is that leadership always has parity between what they call reds and what they call blues. That is to say, people who identify as conservative or Republican and people who identify as liberal or Democrat. And so one of the things I just wanted to point out to the audience before I start talking here was that John and I are actually modeling that right now. John ran for office as a Republican candidate for Congress I generally identifies as a conservative. While I wouldn't necessarily call myself liberal, I've certainly voted Democrat my entire life, and members of my family have run for office as Democrats. So, we are very much kind of living the Braver Angels balance right there. I'm going to offer some viewpoints on why we're polarized that, John, you may disagree with, and actually I would really welcome that, because I think that could be a really interesting ground for conversation. I'll say that in terms of why we're polarized, rather than just giving a synopsis myself, I think that I want to encourage the members of the community here. I've gotten the picture from watching your videos that the community is very interested in educating itself and growing together. And so I want to recommend two books which have really influenced my thinking. One is called Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. And the other is called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America by Lee Drutman. And Lane and Eugene, let me know if it's helpful to put links to those in the chat, because if it is, I'm happy to drop those in. Would that be helpful?
It is helpful, thank you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and put those in there. These two books are very different in their focus, but they both have an account of what led to the polarization of our country, or at least a big part of it. It's worth understanding it in historical context. Most of our understanding of polarization is about the change that has happened since about 1990. The mid-1990s till about 2020 is a period of just, if you look at a graph of almost any measure of polarization, just going up and up and up. And particularly not just polarization, but what's called affective polarization, which is not just to say that you identify with a party, but that you have really strong and really negative feelings about the other party. You hate them, you dislike them, you see them as enemies rather than as people you disagree with. And by all measures, that has been increasing since roughly the 90s. And so the question of why that has progressed has been one that a lot of scholars have engaged. But in my perspective on this, central to all accounts of it is race. And I think this is actually one of the things that many people who are conservative disagree with me about, but I think it's actually really important to put out there. In the 1950s, which is the comparison point most recent in American politics, there was a period of remarkable depolarization in American politics, so much so that the American Association of Political Science issued a paper about how to polarize our politics. They were concerned that the parties didn't stand for anything. They called them Tweedledum and Tweedledee, that they were basically the same thing. There was no real choice, and that the parties needed to stand for something different. And that was the era of the time. But what most scholars would agree accounted for that was that both parties had liberal and conservative members. So you had, in the Republican Party of that era, you had Western Republicans who were more conservative. You kind of almost libertarian in their disposition. And then Northeastern Republicans, you could think of the Rockefellers, who were sort of a more pro-business liberal Republicans in the Northeast. Whereas in the Democratic Party, you had a coalition that included Southern conservatives in most of the former Confederacy, as well as Northeastern and urban, more diverse populations that were very liberal in their policies and preferences. And somehow these two parties both held all of that within their party framework. The scholar I mentioned, Lee Drutman, describes it as a four-party system within a two-party system. But what you see happening over the course of the late 20th century and into the 21st century is the conservative wing of the Democratic Party is disappearing, and the liberal wing of the Republican Party is disappearing to the point where there's almost no crossover at this point. It's all liberal in the Democratic Party and all conservative in the Republican Party, at least at the level of politicians. If you look at when and how that happened, it's centrally connected to the civil rights movement. What happened in the 60s was that the Democratic Party, which had been a traditional home for Dixiecrats, who were Southern segregationists, promoters of Jim Crow, but like you could call them neo-Confederates in a way. Dixiecrats had been in the Democratic Party since literally the Civil War. But when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, favoring advances for civil rights, suddenly there was a mass revolt. That combined over time with another element of polarization besides race, which I think is central here, is religious. as the Democratic Party lost many of its Southern racial conservatives, it also began to adopt many of the modern social movement ideologies of the modern metropolitan individualistic culture, the sexual revolution, gender revolution, many of these factors. And so at that point, a lot of religious conservatives also started to flee. And the result of those was that between the 1960s and the 1980s, you had an almost complete departure of Southern conservatives from the Democratic Party, such as the Democratic Party became almost entirely a liberal or progressive party. I think it's so important to name that context of race, because the other thing that happened when that happened, simultaneous to the departure of the Southern white conservatives, there used to be a lot of Black Republicans. In the 1920s, there was a ton. In fact, they were the party of Lincoln. And that changed in the 1930s with some of the work of the New Deal. And then it changed again in the 1960s, so that these days you have a 90-10 voting pattern among African Americans in favor of Democrats. And so what you have in that situation is the Republican Party has become an almost entirely white party, whereas the Democratic Party contains the vast majority of all Black people. And there's a different story when it comes to Asian Americans and Asian Americans. That means that it's not just a matter of different ideologies, which is what we talked about in that sorting, but also different identities. And that's where I think so much of this affective polarization, where it's not just that you and I disagree, it's you're not like me, you aren't who I am, and I don't trust you. So that's my account of it, but I know that is a at least potentially tendentious account, potentially from the left side of the aisle account. And so, John, if you disagree, I would love to open the space for that, because I think that's part of the important conversation.
Yeah, sure. No, I hate to disappoint you, Silas. I don't really disagree with your analysis, but I mean, what I can say, I will say that so many conservatives will seize upon, and not just conservatives, many center-left liberals as well will seize upon the fact that there was a sort of, the idea is that there's sort of a new brand of identity politics that arose in the aftermath, particularly the aftermath of the civil rights movement, or you might date it to the rising of the Black Power movement within the civil rights movement, that then came to sort of characterize the way in which not just African Americans, but many historically or traditionally marginalized groups tended to advocate for their interests, which is to say, advocating for their interests on the basis of a shared identity and a shared struggle that really centered that identity as sort of the center of gravity for activism. So people point at Martin Luther King Jr. and say that, yes, well, Dr. King was certainly seeking the advancement of civil rights for an African-American community historically subjugated. He was doing so in a way that sought to emphasize sort of our transcendent humanity in a way that, I mean, there's sort of a quote that there are a number of quotes. Obviously, we're all familiar with, judge us not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. But, you can think of King saying, I look forward to the day when men will shout neither Black power nor white power, but God's power and human power, right? And King had definite problems with the Black power phrase itself and with the Black Power sort of movement, because he felt that it was sort of, in a sense, striking against the effort to create a common identification sort of with humanity. And so many people, certainly conservatives and some liberals, will look at that mode of activism that tended to be a bit more militant, tended to be a little bit less consensus oriented, as being a big part of what set the stage for a larger kind of breaking in our politics. And, I think that there is some kernel of truth to that as well, that doesn't negate what Silas is saying. But to the larger historical pattern that Silas is pointing to, it's worth also pointing out that even that phenomenon, so the modern phenomenon, I guess, of identity politics, sort of comes in the aftermath of a longer history in which you had depolarization between the parties resting on a mutual exclusion, if you will, of the interests of African Americans. And I think that Ezra Klein, I think he goes into this in the book you mentioned, Silas. And so, for instance, you go back to the 1930s, and go back to the New Deal era, housing legislation. There There's legislation that was put forward to house Americans during, a time of obviously great economic depression that, as it was advanced by particularly very liberal Democrats in Congress, was intended to be integrated. Southern Democrats wanted to see public housing built, poor working class constituents, but they didn't want that to be integrated. Republicans, many sort of business-minded Republicans, opposed the expansion of public housing as an economic and a philosophical and a policy matter, but as a means of sort of leveraging the antipathy towards African Americans, towards sort of killing that legislation. They actually came and said, we'll support this legislation so long as it's guaranteed to be integrated, because they knew that the Southern Democrats would never go for that. And so what happens is you have liberal Democrats having to choose between supporting an integrated version of the bill, of this legislation, that might fail, or a segregated version of it that might succeed. And ultimately, they made common cause with Southern Democrats on the basis of guaranteeing that public housing would remain segregated. And that, of course, contributed to the larger ghettoization, that is to say, the continuing sort of shepherding or herding of Black people into ghetto communities that set the stage for so much else in terms of the struggle of African Americans and in American life across the 20th and even into the 20th century, even into the current day. And so it was through that sort of exclusion of African Americans that Republicans and Democrats held their coalitions together, and in certain cases were able to work across the aisle, right? And so the ferocity with which, the sort of zeal with which many folks wish to organize around their identities in conspicuous terms is in part a response to the disillusionment with the idea that, sort of a depolarized body politic necessarily means that all voices are genuinely included. That you had to sort of center Black identity and Blackness for Blackness to be visible and felt in the body politic. Now, I consider myself to be in sort of the Kingian camp when it comes to the philosophy of activism that I would seek to sort of embody. But it's hard to argue with the historical sort of reasoning and motivation for some of that. And so this is me adding a little bit more historical and sort of, social context to Silas's analysis. But I don't disagree with the overall picture that you're painting, Silas. There's one little point that I would add to it also in the area of the religious transformation that took place in American society. I think that it is worth reckoning with the fact that part of that siloing really does have to do with a consolidation of religious conservatism, cultural, evangelical Christianity on the right, that in part has to do with a desire to keep the church sort of segregated and so forth, but not entirely. Billy Graham's movement was an integrated crusade, bringing together Christians from across the color line that also had deep appeal in the South. There is a way in which the secularization, I think, of the left and Democratic Party has also contributed to this siloing in a way that doesn't entirely necessarily lean on the racial analysis. So I wouldn't say your analysis is completely sufficient to explain it, Silas, but I don't disagree with it.
And just to say it, I 100% agree with John that there are elements of the religious siloing that have nothing to do with race. There are some that do have to do with race, but there are many that have nothing to do with race. And so it's a sort of two cause as opposed to one central cause.
Right. Yeah. That brings that's a good segue into this next question I want to ask. So, do I understand that in addition to working with the general public, you work with corporations and government organizations as well?
Yes, that is correct. Now, I think that our programmatic work with corporations at this stage is still somewhat limited. I mean, I've given presentations to Target, to General Mills, to Lucasfilms, to some major American corporations. And we have a department that's sort of building out that work more. But I don't think that we have established a sort of regular ongoing programs. For the most part, I think that up until this stage, the extent of our interaction with corporations has more been, say, for instance, somebody like me going to, Target, speaking to 5,000 employees or whatnot, and sort of giving an overall presentation about how we have depolarizing conversations that allow us to sort of work together well in the workplace and maintain our relationships and so forth. It may be that we're doing more with some folks than I realize. Let's think about Braver Angels. It's such a sprawling sort of community. We've got so many things going on in different places that it's a pretty regular thing for somebody to come to me and say, hey, we're doing, X, Y, and Z, with this group in this state, this county. And it's like, John, what do you think of that? I was like, I didn't even know we were doing that. I didn't know we knew these people, right? So, but yeah, we've had more, I think we've had deeper engagement, however, with elected officials, with some local governments, leagues and associations of state legislators, county commissioners, and that's about to accelerate dramatically. We're on the verge of launching an initiative called Braver Politics. I'm giving you guys a little bit of inside information here, but it's going to come out at the end of this month, wherein we are going to be seeking to seed Braver Angels workshops at every level of government across the country in partnership with some major national organizations to depolarize the culture of politics, particularly on the state and local and even school board level. And so stay tuned.
Thank you.
Yay. Well,
Might
like
be
you
good,
say,
right?
it's yay.
Might be a good thing.
You think?
I think. I'm hoping so.
I'm curious because I thank you for talking about the intersectionality of politics and race, right? And this whole depolarization effort, because it is very important. And I know that there is a spinoff group called Braver Angels of Color. I've been to a couple of meetings, and that is for people of color who come from red and blue, if you will, to have conversations and workshops and so forth. Do you guys know a lot about that? Is there anyone here today from that organization? Because I did ask a couple of people to come, and the ladies who were in charge of driving that were not available. But I was very happy to see that. But I just want to say as well that it is important. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. Black Republicans, right? Think differently, and in that regard to coming together on the level of humanity, we absolutely have to talk to each other. And I know that there were several gentlemen in the last meeting that said, people, my brothers and sisters tell me I'm a sellout and so forth. What's your experience, Mr. Wood, with that? How do we bridge that gap? What kind of conversations do we need to have?
Yeah, it's a great question because the African American community. I'm going to speak in the context of the African American community specifically here for a moment, just because it's the lane of this I know best. But the Black community is not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination in terms of our larger sort of social and cultural perspectives and experiences, right? And the diversity of Black America, when you really explore it, is something that's striking even to Black people, right? Because just because you're Black doesn't really mean that you have a full grasp of that. And that's kind of part of the opportunity that I think the Braver Angels of Color group gives people to sort of learn firsthand. And so Braver Angels has a number of subgroups and caucuses. We have, Braver Angels of Color, Conservative Caucus, and others, where people come together in particular points of connection, but still within the Braver Angels spirit, right? To be able to talk about issues sort of, particularly germane to them, and then to bring those conversations back to the larger community in various forms and fashions. But I think that what I want to see take place in all communities, and certainly within the African American community, is sort of a depolarizing of the sort of intra-community conversation in a way that recognizes the dignity and the legitimacy of the spectrum of Black experiences, so we can engage in a productive sort of heterodox dialogue on the spectrum of African American points of view, right? So look, I'm African American. I would have been a slave during slavery, without a doubt. If I was in the context that the vast majority of Black people were in. But I'm mixed race. My father is white from the South, originally from Tennessee. I grew up in a multicultural, middle-class suburban community in Culver City, in Los Angeles, right? In a very sort of progressive area. And actually, me and Silas, we've compared our experiences back and forth. I had very little experience with racism, like virtually none. And actually, to the extent to which any explicit racism was ever aimed at me, it didn't come from white folks. There's some black and brown tension that I had a little bit of proximity to, that I remember sort of experiencing. And so, I grew up I tell people I grew up in Dr. King's promised land. I grew up in, the world that King was striving for. In part, I would say, as a consequence of the work of King and the leaders of the nonviolent movement and the civil rights movement, but the cultural kind of circumstance of my upbringing. I had cousins and so forth and family members who lived in the inner city. My wife is from the Jordan Downs Projects in Watts, just distinctly different upbringing and life experience than I have, even though geographically we're close to each other, because socioeconomically, Watts and Culver City are 15 minutes and 1,500 light years apart. 15 minutes apart geographically and light years apart socioeconomically. Silas and I have a different experience because Silas grew up in Texas. He's not that much older than me, but he was exposed to things that I was not. But for African Americans in general, you've got some people who are more assimilated, so to speak, or integrated in white settings. You got some people who grew up in overwhelmingly Black communities. You have some people who grow up in urban environments. Some people grow up in rural environments. Some people go to college. Some people go right into the workforce. Some people who are in the church. Some people who are in books. And, not that the two are at all exclusive, of course, but the point being that we take in different strands of the American experience, and that shows up in different sort of manifestations of Blackness and so forth. And we all, in my opinion, have something to contribute to the overall understanding of American life and the Black experience to each other. But if we shut other people out of the conversation simply because of how they vote or where they come down on this issue or that, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to get to know ourselves better as part of a collective experience. And so, yes, I think that the cross-partisan and the sort of, if you will, cross-subcultural conversation within Black America matters a great deal. And then I think something similar could be said for other groups as well. And so the Angels of Color Caucus is an expression of that within Braver Angels.
Yeah, the value of interracial and intraracial conversations, very important. Thank you for that. Silas, John mentioned your personal experience. Did you want to share something about that?
Yeah, well, there was at least 2 or 3 points that I wanted to pick up on from what John shared. So I think one of the big themes of what John is sharing is complexifying our picture of what people of any given race believe or have experienced. And I just think that that's so central. And I was one of the founding members of the Braver Angels of Color Caucus. And one of the interesting things that popped up early on was that many of the people of color, particularly African Americans who came there, were conservative African Americans, which, nationwide that day, that's by no means the majority. But one of the things that's interesting is I think Braver Angels makes a safe space for people who feel like they don't fit in with their box to have a place to go, which is one reason why I think that it has attracted some people in those communities. But to this point about boxes and how you fit in, there's a stat that I think is just crucially important for people to understand. Across races, people identify as conservative, moderate, and liberal at roughly equal rates. I'm going to say that again. Across races, people identify as conservative, liberal, and moderate at roughly equal rates. It's not 100% equal. For every group, the plurality, not the majority, but the plurality, slightly like ballpark a third, but slightly more, identify as conservative, except for African Americans, where the plurality identifies moderate. So if you put moderate and conservative together for any racial group, it's more than a majority. And that is just so mind-blowing to most people, because if you look at voting patterns, the overwhelming majority of people of color of all races vote Democrat. And just so people can be aware of some of these statistics, it's changed a little bit recently, but it's in the ballpark of, for African-American people, 90-10 Democrat voting. For Latino and Asian American, very similar. It's in the ballpark of 60-40 or 70-30 towards Democrats. For white people, it's in the ballpark of 55-45 towards Republicans or 60-40 towards Republicans. And Native Americans, unfortunately, it's just the hardest statistical evidence to find. It looks similar as best people can estimate to Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans. So there's this interesting paradox that I think is really central, which is that the vast majority of people of color are voting Democrat, but the majority of people of color identify as moderate or conservative, which is strange. Whereas with the white people who are voting Democrat, they're overwhelmingly people identifying as liberal. And so you have this phenomenon where people assume the liberal position on an issue is the African-American position, is the people of color position, but it's not. And if you survey the population, that's not the opinion of the population. And so much of our kind of equation of party with ideology applies to white people in a reasonably reliable way. To people of color, not so. You can't predict someone's ideology just by their party when it comes to people of color in this country. This is really complex, and it really makes you think twice. I've been in so many contexts where there is a default discussion of what Black people want or what people of color want, entirely among a group of white people, that is essentially what liberal white people want. And if you ask those same people of color, particularly the working class ones, which is the majority of all groups are working class people, you will find that their attitudes, opinions, and preferences are totally different, and that so much of our discourse around the interests as a group are substituting ideology for identity in mistaken ways. And so when John's talking about complexifying this narrative, recognizing the existence of Black conservatives, recognizing the existence of Black moderates, I just think that's such an important piece of the puzzle of having an honest conversation about anything related to race or polarization. As it relates to my own personal experience, I think this is also really another version of this complexifying narrative. So John alluded to, I grew up, I'm a little bit older than John. I grew up in Houston, Texas in the 80s and 90s. And the environment I grew up in was not MLK's dream, as John described, Culver City, California. It was very brutal. So my background, and if people can't tell, I'm half Indian. My father was an immigrant from India. And my mother is a white woman from a small town in West Virginia. And they met in Louisiana, married in Louisiana at a time when interracial marriage was not particularly well accepted, moved to Houston, Texas at a time when that was still kind of a questionable status to be in. There were certainly people in our neighborhood, which was majority white when we moved in, that were not, they didn't want their kids to play with me and my brother because we're mixed race kids. Growing up in my schools, the racialized bullying was unvarnished. People would just stand and yell racial slurs in the lunchroom, and nobody would do anything. And those racial slurs would be used to pick fistfights. And then the fistfights would be about establishing dominance between groups. We had extreme racial tension in our high school. All the tables were completely segregated by race: white table, Black table, Hispanic table. You would have fistfights across the groups. And by the way, it wasn't just a narrative of like white oppression. I mean, certainly I think the system came from a historical white supremacy framework, but there was extreme tension between Blacks and Hispanics at times, to the point of racialized, I wouldn't call it quite gang fights, because it wasn't really organized like that, but just like mob fights across different racial groups. The white kids were not afraid to say very racist things that we would not at all tolerate now. This was just the environment I grew up in. And there was a lot of racialized poverty, which is all around me growing up. And so in that environment, I mean, for me to ever even imagine that like nowadays, as an Asian American guy who's professional, or a mixed race Asian American guy who's professional, people are like, oh, you must have had privilege, your dad must be a doctor, you must be, and it's just not my experience of life. And so much of my life was just defined by this aggressive racism, just people rubbing in your face as a way of asserting their dominance over you. And so when John and I come down on different sides of these questions of politics and racial ideology, I can't help but think that some part of that is just lived experience, and I think that's true. Like, as I've gotten to know more and more people of color, I'll meet people who have literally the same genetic background as me, who have had opposite experiences of discrimination in life. And they're like, this hasn't been too bad for me. And so that's another thing that I think we can't always presume that everybody who has a certain skin color or a certain last name experienced oppression the same way or experienced racism the same way. Some people have experienced it very viscerally and vividly, and some people have had a very, frankly, positive experience of their racial identity. And oftentimes that doesn't track our stereotypes. Sometimes maybe the Asian American guy got it rough, and the Black guy had people thinking highly of him, or maybe it's the opposite. You just can't assume that. So I think that those kind of complexifying of our narratives are so much of what the work of dialogue is, so much of what the work of letting people be who they are instead of demanding that they fit in a box, demanding that they must vote a certain way, think a certain way, speak a certain way because of what they look like or what their identity is. So that I think is something really where John and I really strongly agree, is letting people be who they are instead of fitting into the box that we have presumed that they must fit into.
Thank you.
Yep.
Dialogue.
Such great confirmation.
Yeah. Yeah, truly. And so I want to open this up for our Q&A. And so just real fast, the instructions are this. If you want to raise your hand, like Ann did, go to the reactions button on the lower right-hand side of your screen, take your cursor there, click on the reactions button, and you'll see the little bar that says raise hand. If you don't find it there, go to participants on the opposite side of the icons there. To participants, click on the up arrow, find your name, click on your name, and on the three dots to the right of that, there should be a way for you to raise your hand there. Again, asking that we keep our questions and comments to a minute or less, so that we have time for you to ask your question, but also for the speakers having time to answer the question. All righty, so we have Ann, and then we have Joe.
Yes, I am part of a group of people who are being trained in Westchester County to lead various restorative justice processes. And I watched the film. It was the whole progress was quite similar to what we do. My question is, how do you choose the people to participate in this? Because we do quite a lot of individual conversations beforehand to see if they really are ready to participate. And what is the minimum amount of time that you could have a workshop to bring people together that would be effective?
Well, thank you for the question, Ann, and I'm glad to hear about the work that you're doing. I think that a lot of our hope for a saner and more ethical and humane justice system, political culture in general, lies on the innovations that come out of the restorative justice arena. So I'm very much applauding of you for that. I think that we take people who come to us, sign up, whether as members or just sign up, not necessarily as members, but looking for an activity. A lot of the people come to us through word of mouth. So in other words, we have people who have experienced the workshop who then will go to a neighbor or a friend and say, you know what, I think that this would be great for you. This was great for me. Please do this with me, or please give this a chance. We have people who come to us because they are having breakdowns of communication in their own family, and they'll go to their relatives and say, we haven't been able to communicate the way I've wanted us to for a while, but I think that this can help. We don't do a great deal of screening, to be honest, in terms of who participates in our workshop on the participant level. There's a bit of screening in terms of who moderates and facilitates our workshops, but even then we are, just looking for people with some relevant experience, right? That's really the major thing there. And so, we rely a lot on people's goodwill and good faith coming into the space to be the thing that helps sort of set the larger parameters for the behavior. Now we have rules, and those rules are set forth, at the beginning of the engagement. And, I think, tend to want for our moderators and facilitators to be flexible enough to recognize the fact that these conversations can be hard. And so if somebody gets a bit emotional or gets a little angry or agitated, that's okay, as long as they really sincerely wish to continue participating and are willing to take the time to take a breath, and return to the sort of, the spirit of the room that we seek to maintain. There are occasions where people have to be asked to leave. That does happen. But in general, I find that our overall confidence in the goodwill of the human spirit on the part of people who choose to be there is pretty well founded and allows us to be able to scale out these workshops without a heavy degree of screening or regulation. And so also I should mention to your question about length, we have different formats. For a group sort of format along the lines of what I was describing earlier, our shortest version of that is 3 hours. But we have other things such as sort of one-to-one conversational models where we basically have a script that people can follow, or sort of a sheet of prompts that can take people through a certain subject without a moderator or facilitator. And those usually unfold in 2 separate 1-hour sessions. So it's really just a question of which particular design we're referring to.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
May I just say, before we go to Joe's question, that braverangels.org is the website. You can find resources there and information about their programs and engagement opportunities, as well as information about John's podcast and a whole lot of stuff.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ann. Joe?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. This is a wonderful presentation. I'm so glad to be back here. I believe I first heard of Braver Angels recently about some workshop that was being held in Maine around, I think, a school board controversy that was happening there with an African-American superintendent, a Black superintendent. So I think that was your organization. But my question is related to, do you have work ongoing around gender identity and also sexual identity? Does that come up in any of your communities, and how has that impacted the organization?
Great question.
Yeah, it does come up, certainly in the context of individual workshop conversations and some of our media content. But we do not really have much developed in the way of specific sort of programs and interventions and conversational models built around that theme. We've gone much deeper in the area of race than we've gone in the area of gender identity and sexual orientation, sexual orientation in terms of designing specific programming. But I do imagine that we will get to that point over time. And part of what I think we need to do and very much want to do is to be able to bring in increasingly a representative constituency of Americans, of leaders that can help us build out the competency to be able to forge some of these models in ways that can allow us to sort of craft and implement them with some confidence. So we're not quite there to the degree to which we would like to be at this time, but I do believe we will get there.
Questions, comments?
It's a quiet room today.
Hi guys, I missed the intro to this phase of the conversation, so I don't know if it's okay. I just heard y'all asking for comments and said it's been quiet.
Well, okay. Well, Kyle, we're asking for questions for our presenters, Mr. Silas Kulkarni and Mr. John Wood Jr. of Braver Angels, which is the national organization working to depolarize America, the work for the depolarization of race and politics. So that's what's happening. Okay.
Do you want questions in the chat if we have them, or is
you can either way. Either way.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here.
Actually, I have a question. And thanks for the presentation so far. You're speaking to a need that resonates with me personally in some of the anti-racism spaces, and the need to move that conversation forward in a way that's not bogged down by, that doesn't come with the baggage that I think is most common in a lot of our rooms. And today's presentation was spoken to me in that way. So I will offer that, and thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.
Kelly, welcome.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So, John or Silas, either one of you that wants to jump in on this, I designed a program last year. It was a 6-part series, and it was based on a book called Talking Across the Divide. And a lot of where that came from, I mean, politics were in there, but it was really any kind of controversial issue that divides us from a human perspective, and we come out fighting, right? Because we're passionate about our position and we believe that we're right. And they talked a lot about coming into that conversation from a place of vulnerability and true curiosity, where we're not trying to change one another's minds. We're just really trying to understand one another's experiences genuinely. And it doesn't even mean tolerance. It's just truly understanding, right? You understand why I'm so passionate about my position, and I understand why you're so passionate about yours, even though they're opposite. And what came up a lot was the media and how, you know, you guys were talking about in the 90s, it was a totally different thing. And a lot of that Pew Research came up, and it said that, you know, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we sat down to dinner and we were all watching the same news broadcasts. So we were all hearing the same thing. And now we have so many options, and they're all coming from their own, you know, slant. So is that something that you guys talk about in your sessions, or address a way to kind of combat that? And that's probably a bigger question than we have time for, but is that something that comes up?
Absolutely. It's been a central discussion topic. And I think there's almost no theorist of polarization or scholar who doesn't see the changes in the media as somehow connected. In the 90s, we got cable news, and that was the beginning of it. And then in the 2000s, we got the internet. And then in 2010, or roughly 2009, I think it was, when Facebook invented the like button, suddenly we got the personalized feed and Twitter, all that. And that last generation has been the one where we've really seen this explode. So I believe, and I think most of us do, that it is centrally connected to the question of polarization. I'll just add along with that one of the exercises that a group of Brave Angels from Texas decided to do, that they invented, was I think it was walk a week in my news. So, you know, like walk a day in my shoes, walk a week in my news. And they literally just had people swap news feeds with each other. Just read. I'm just going to share with you everything I would be reading for a week, and you read it, and don't read your stuff. You just read your mind, and then vice versa. And you know, it's quite immediately apparent how you could conclude completely different things about the universe when you're reading different information sources. There's a lot more to say about that, but it's been a topic of debates, it's been a topic of workshops, it's been a topic of self-created activities, and I think we all see it as a central part of the conversation. John, did you want anything on that?
Yeah, I love the way Kelly's face lit up at the walk a mile in my news segment. Yeah, no, it's a great thing. I won't add to your answer, Silas, but I will recommend a book myself for folks to consider here by our colleague Monica Guzman, who's director of storytelling at Braver Angels, called "I Never Thought About It That Way: How to Have Fearlessly," if I'm getting it right, if I'm remembering correctly, how to have fearlessly curious conversations in dangerously divided times. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the description for everyone here to the New York Times review of this book. It's off to an incredible start. It's an Amazon bestseller, and Monica's out on tour right now, talking to people about it. But the core sort of message of it is that the power of curiosity is simply indispensable to our being able to have the conversations and to hold the relationships in place that can allow us to maintain a culture of mutual humanization, not just in politics, but across every dimension of our lives, right? And there's no more powerful representative of that value than our colleague Monica. And so I very much encourage people to check out the article and to grab the book.
Thank you both.
Great question, Kelly. Thank you so very much. We have Adine, and then Judith, and then Vicky.
Okay, thank you. What a fantastic conversation. Oh my goodness. I have so many questions, but I'm only allowed a short period of time. I wanted you to talk about the intra-racial tensions within a group, particularly our African-American community, based on socioeconomic differences, educational differences, skin color differences, which have left us less sensitive to the struggles of our underclass that lack strong advocacy.
Yeah, thank you for that, Adine. That's a question very close to my heart. So I'll build a little bit on some of what I was talking about earlier. So, again, I, mixed race African American, grew up in a multicultural community, and was not only did I not experience racism, at least not in any way I could sort of immediately identify, but there's a significant degree to which I was sort of celebrated for my skin color. Just because the value of integration was sort of so pronounced in the community that I grew up in, and I'm not alone in that. And yet, even given that fact, there's a way in which even some of the Black kids who I went to school with, actually maybe most of them, were living in a reality that was very different from mine, even though we were in the same school setting, because many of them were bused in from inner city LA. They weren't living in the suburbs with me. They spoke differently, they dressed differently, I'm a little bit lighter complexion, and that's a variable worth perhaps keeping in mind as well. I wrote an article for Braver Angels that was also condensed and published in the Wall Street Journal. And folks might actually be interested in that too. In the Wall Street Journal version, it's called Black Lives Can Be Very Different, I think. We can find links. But I talk about the fact that me and my wife grew up 15 minutes away from each other, and I talk about the LA riots. We're coming up on the 30th anniversary now. The riots are a faint blip in my memory. I remember, at the age of 5, that there was tension in my house, weird things on the news. My mother went out the door to go to work. My father was a bit panicked after she left. Later, he told me it was the scariest moment of his life. He wondered if she'd come back home again. And there were some things happening in Culver City, but ultimately she came back home and was just fine, and life went on. 15 minutes and 15 miles away, my wife was 4 years old, laying on the floor in her house in the projects.
Yes.
Gunfire, explosion, sirens outside, people running back and forth, people yelling and screaming, people coming in and out the door, our parents telling her to stay away from the windows. And of course, she, eyes were glued to the TV in the aftermath of the Rodney King beating, and the world went up into the beginning of her American experience is in an American war zone,
Mm.
And again, we both have Black experiences, right? But in our adulthoods, I was always, I was very much moved by the Obama campaign in 2008. I very much considered myself a liberal activist in high school. I threw myself behind Obama's campaign. I believed in his message. This is not a Black, white, or Latino America. It's the United States of America, not red states, blue states. We're the United States. This post-partisan, post-racial sort of ethos, his mixed race kind of experience spoke deeply to my conception of an America that was morally on the rise, if you will. And for my wife, there was a great deal of pride and for her family in the Obamas, Michelle and the kids and so forth. But, this American idealism layered over the Black experience was something that for her was just sort of like, what reality are you living in exactly? Now, over the course of time, we've gotten to know each other's experiences. And I think and not just her and not just me, perhaps in her case, but, she's deepened my understanding of a version of the Black experience in American society that's caused me to not be complacent with the status quo reality of Black America, where I think I've been able to show her a version of the Black American experience that's caused her to understand how it is some Black people genuinely can feel deeply sort of, invested and blessed by the American experience and by what they've inherited from American society. And in that, I think we've enriched our understanding of Black America, of American society, broadly speaking, and each other. And so, it just goes back to what Silas was talking about the sort of, the complexifying the narrative so we can enrich our sort of human understanding of each other. And from that point, from that position, set the stage for us to be able to honestly reckon with the problems that are left needing to be addressed in American society, so we can make it better for everybody. If we don't engage in that work of knowing each other, it's never going to happen.
Thank
I
you.
just want to speak to this as well because I think it's so central. I always like to anchor understanding in some degree of statistics or facts. 2/3 of Americans don't have a college degree. 2/3. And that's higher among people of color. And by the way, highest among Hispanic people in America. That stat should make anybody who thinks about their picture of an American as somebody with a college degree do a double take. And so when you talk about this divide based on education and income and how that interacts with these racial issues, I think it could not be more important. It is just so easy to take the perspective of those with college degrees as if it's the norm, because all the positions of power, whether it's journalism, university, politics, a business, they're all occupied by people with college degrees, and yet the vast majority of all of us are somebody else. And so how do you reckon with that? In the past we had unions, which became one of the main venues for speaking up for people who are working class, so that they actually had a voice at the table. But unions have been on decline for generations. Churches in the past were also another way in which people from working class backgrounds were often represented in more public life, but church membership is declining. So what are the venues for people who are not college educated, who are not professional class, to be represented in American life, in American discourse, in our conception of who we are and who needs what? And that's a hard question. I don't have an easy answer. I know, by the way, as a side note, that Braver Angels has been working on it, has created a Working People's Caucus and Working People's Forum that regularly brings working class people to speak and talk, not as sort of the topic, but as the speakers. But that is a very small drop in a bucket of a very large challenge that I think is really glad you named.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Adine. Thank you for that question. We have Judith, Vicky, and then Jenny. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I'm so sorry I missed the first half hour of this presentation. And thank you to John and Silas for bringing this conversation, this discussion, this awareness. I just have a question with regards to your mission. Is it to address polarization in politics or polarization regarding race and politics?
So yeah.
Go ahead. And then something else I just want to add, John. You describe yourself as mixed race. With the exception of African Americans who lived in the Gullah country and Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, most African Americans in this country are mixed race. Mm-hmm. And the mixed race origin was from the holding cells in Africa, as well as on the ships during the Middle Passage, where Black women, and here and in any slave in community where people were described as slaves, where women were considered property of the slave owners. And so mixed race among African Americans is 400 years old. We're all mixed race. Okay, I may not have an immediate parent who is Caucasian or Latino or whatever. Okay, but my father's grandmother was a white woman. On my mother's side, she was mixed with African, Jamaican, and German Jew. And so I'm just saying this to say that, and I'm not a unique. Most African Americans in this country are of mixed race. So I think that what creates and adds to polarization among us, or intra-cultural polarization, first of all, began with plantation life. Plantation life created intracultural polarization. and polarization occurred mostly out of the need for survival. A lot of Black people felt, you know, if I come across as being more loyal to Massa, I have a chance of not experiencing as severe a punishment as the person who is openly defiant.
Judith, Judith, you know, we love you. You are so wise and you have so much to share. We have 15 minutes left in the program. Let's let John, no, it's okay. Let's let John answer your questions though.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, no, but thank you for that very much, Judith. I mean, you know, Judith, I don't have any disagreements with what you're saying. I acknowledge the truth. You know, it's funny. We got our we got our 23andMe's back, right? It actually turns out, according to 23andMe anyway, when you break it down, I am something along the lines of like 32% of African descent. I'm like 60% British and Irish, and 8% sort of a smattering of Asian Indian, and with some Chinese and Native American in there. And my wife says, she says, you catfished me. You know, she's like, I think she said, I thought you was half. She was like, she's like, you mostly white. No wonder my kids like mayonnaise and whatnot. And so, you know, but in love, I mean, race is a social construct to begin with. So anytime, you know, you hear me make reference to sort of racial categories, it is something of a functional concession to the normative language that we are used to using, right? But I do agree that there's a deeper project of understanding just kind of, you know, the real significance and also non-significance in certain ways, you know, of these terms and sort of conventional ways of thinking about things that, you know, it's going to take us some time to sort of unravel. But I do acknowledge the truth in what you're saying. And as far as defining Braver Angels' mission goes, you know, yeah, I oftentimes define our work as, you know, depolarizing American politics, but also sort of reviving, if you will, the communal spirit of American democracy. Healing racial wounds is at the center of that, but it's not the only part of it. And even to the degree to which it's a ubiquitous issue, matters of race intersect with matters of faith, intersect with matters of community and structural analysis and history, so on and so forth. You kind of can't, for the purposes of communication, we have to categorize things. But at the end of the day, things are so interwoven that fundamentally I look at this as a project of community healing, community building, and community restoration, within which there are many particular issues we have to engage with, politics being sort of our starting sort of entry point to that project. And of course, a big thing we have to focus on in terms of catalyzing a shift in the consciousness of our governing institutions, but starting with the people and affecting that sort of from the ground, from the demand level up, if you will. So I'm giving you a more nuanced sort of representation of our mission, but I think that for this space, it's worth it to get to give you the multiple dimensions of the understanding of that.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, we have Vicky and then Jenny. Jenny will be our last question for the day. Well, for the program. Keep asking questions, curiosity.
Okay, I have a school board meeting tonight. And so, John, you said something very briefly that definitely caught my attention. So when you said you're looking at a new initiative that's going to be rolled out later this month, was it Braver Policies?
Braver Politics. Braver
Politics.
And yeah, and there's nothing on the website up right now, I don't believe, but check back in the final week of April this month. So just I
think I got stuck on policies because our school board, not our school board, well, most of our school board and our school districts across the United States seem to be steeped in policies that keep this whole compliance focus for our children in place. So that's something I'm going to play with as far as we need braver policies in our district, so that we're not putting this focus on compliance into cement for these kids, because their kids are getting damaged they're so disengaged to the point of suicide and drug addictions because they're not being heard and treated as human beings in the classroom enough.
Right. Well, I do hope.
Thanks. I appreciate your work.
Of course, and I do hope the braver politics can lead to braver policies, to be sure. Right. So I encourage folks to check it out. That announcement will be coming at the end of this month. And we're going to be building this up into a significant national campaign over time. And there's going to be room for everybody to be involved who might have a mind to be. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Jenny Stillman.
Yeah, right. What a wonderful presentation. I thank both of you. But I was going to ask a question. Silas, if you can talk a little bit more to about the books that you recommend and sort of why.
Yeah, absolutely. So the two I mentioned, one, Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. It's just an extremely thoughtful and thorough history of the issue and current analysis of what the author thinks we should do. And for what's worth, I don't actually agree with his solutions, but I think that his analysis and his thinking and his history has been invaluable to me to understanding the state of the problem. In terms of the other one, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop by Lee Drutman, he has a similar analysis, approaches it from a slightly different angle, includes an international comparison, which I find very relevant. It's a little bit more scholarly. And then the other thing is he has a proposed solution which differs from the other author. So Lee Drutman is a political scientist, and he proposes a move to multi-party democracy in America under the thinking that a huge part of what makes it so antagonistic is when there's only two choices. And he cites a lot of evidence about the ways in which multi-party democracies can take some of the toxicity out of politics, not necessarily solve it or make it perfect. Politics isn't perfect anywhere, but can take some of the temperature down. And I've been really persuaded by that. In fact, I'm actually really interested in the movement for multi-party democracy in America. So those are those two. And then the last one John mentioned, but I just think it's really worth re-mentioning, is our colleague Monica Guzman's, I never thought of it that way. That is much more on a personal level, just how we can engage our own curiosity to get out of that mode that it's so easy for any of us to get into, of antagonism and aggression and I'm right. You must not have anything I haven't heard before in your head, but changing your own lens to one of curiosity. So that's on a very personal level. And I think that's the value of that book.
I'll mention about Monica just very quickly, that Monica is a liberal journalist from Seattle, who is born in Mexico and raised by Mexican immigrant parents who voted for Donald Trump. And so she has been faced with the need to sort of defend sort of the humanity and dignity of her parents to sort of her peers, while also engaging in her own differences within her family, with her parents, in a way that can allow them to sort of understand one another better. And that becomes part of the anchor for this book. But I just feel that personal dynamic, that family dynamic, one, I think it's relevant for, this group as we think about these humanizing interactions across deep divides. And it's a great snapshot of, what America really is, And so, yes, I second and third. I third Silas's seconding of Monica's work. And just thank you all once again for giving us the opportunity to speak to you. This has really been a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. Absolutely. Lane?
Yeah, thank you. I wanna give you both an opportunity to say closing words and offer to us any calls to action that you might have for us, and also to make sure that we know how to engage with Braver Angels. I do have some links to put in the chat, but please feel free to include any resources other than the books that you've already mentioned.
Sure. Well, Silas, if you'd like me to go first here, I mean, my closing.
Actually, John, I think you will have the best last word. You are the best speaker on behalf, so I don't want to call that act. All right. So, in terms of my closing call to action, one thing that we didn't mention here that I think actually deserves mentioning, Braver Angels has a podcast. It also has a debate program. That's actually how I met Reverend Lane. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, because it's one of the easiest, quickest ways to get involved. There's debates monthly. They're on Zoom. Anyone can give a speech. It's not limited to famous or prominent people, anyone can speak and offer your opinion. And I think that's a really lovely way to participate. For all the activities to get involved with on Braver Angels, you can just go to the events page or the Get Involved page, or you can get connected to a local alliance, which will allow you to meet real people in person in your local area. So I highly recommend both the Braver Angels debates and joining an alliance. In terms of my closing thought, I think the theme for me when it comes to depolarization in general and depolarization of race in particular is just this idea of complexifying your narrative, not assuming that there is one picture of what anybody of a certain race, or for that matter, of a certain party believes, but actually asking curiously what they believe, learning about them and making space for that. And concretely, what I think that the challenge that I want to offer to the group is are there people who can even tell you in your social circle, in your organization, in your professional life? Because what I found is, there's an old expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I really believe that expression. But more broadly, if someone's not in the room, it's very unlikely that you're going to know what they think. And so my challenge to you would be, anytime you look around and you say to yourself, whatever group you're talking about, if members of that group aren't in the room, how could you get people from that group into your room to be part of the conversation? Not one, not a token, but several. So you can hear some of the diversity of opinions, so you can check your assumptions, so you can be educated by people's lived experience. So that might mean, are there any working class people in our discussions of economic policy? If not, maybe we should think about how to incorporate them. Are there any people of different races in our discussion of race? And is it just one? Is it just two? Or are there a whole large diversity of people? Get people in the room, invite people into your home, have people there to speak for themselves what their experiences are, and then listen curiously, and you'll get to a far different place than if you started from what the media will tell us or what our assumptions will tell us about who people are.
Thank you. John?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Lane. And thank you, Eugene, and everyone. I very much echo Silas's closing remarks here. And to just add my own briefly, Braver Angels was originally founded as Better Angels, which is a quote of Abraham Lincoln, who made reference to the better angels of our nature, as in his inaugural address, seeking to sort of head off the pending civil war that would ravage the country. We changed it to Braver Angels for two reasons. One had a little bit to do with the trademark dispute, unfortunately. But we wound up landing on the name Braver Angels, in part because, empathy has always been widely recognized as a core value for bridging work. And indeed it is. And you can't do what Silas is recommending, without leaning on the value and virtue of empathy. But anybody who does this sort of thing long enough knows that courage matters as well, whether you do it professionally or just in your own life where you can. Because when you reach out to people who are different from you, not in all cases, of course, but you run the risk of possibly being distrusted and possibly ill-treated by people because you're different from them politically or in other ways. But you also run the risk of maybe being isolated or ostracized by some people, at least, who otherwise agree with you politically, because sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that to reach out to empathize with, and to humanize your opposition, let's say, or those who your in-group may be distrustful of, is to sort of abandon your own convictions or sell out somehow. And that's not true. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the need for love and power. He said that power without love is weak and anemic. Love without power, however, is authoritarian and brutal. Love and goodwill is what will transform American society, but it requires courage to sustain it. And so we sometimes look at the aggressiveness of the warring sort of, political tribes in American society and think that a focus on goodwill is weak in that context. But that is the spiritual strength that holds communities together. And so whatever you believe in politically and socially, however you vote, advocate for those things. But remember that the spirit with which we advocate, the spirit that we bring to our relationships, matters even more, because that's the power that allows us to survive together as a family and to grow. And at the end of the day, that is the vision of the beloved community. That is the dream of America that I believe in, you know, and I yet think that we will get there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you, Braver John Wood Jr. and Silas Kulkarni of Braver Angels. Thank you for continuing to create safe spaces for people to show up as they are, to share lived experience, and to learn from each other and grow together. Eugene, see why I wanted to have them on?
Good going.
Thank you, guys. Folks, braverangels.org, and also subscribe to the YouTube, Braver Angels YouTube channel. There is so much to learn, so many opportunities for engagement. Also, if you are a person of color and you're interested in joining a conversation with Braver Angels of Color, we meet on second Saturdays of the month, and 9 a.m. Pacific and 12 p.m. Eastern. I am putting the email address to the contact if you would like to get on the mailing list. So that is in the chat for Angie Watson Hedgem. Please do join us next week when our guest is going to be our own Race Talk family member, Gretchen Jung, and her co-conspirator, Dr. Stacy Walton of Coming to the Table, another organization who is bringing people together, and in their words, bringing people together to take America beyond the legacy of enslavement. So we're looking forward to that. If you have suggestions for topics or speakers that you would like us to feature, please do email us at info@racetalkrevolution.org. And I will turn this over for last words to my co-host, Eugene Holden.
Again, thank you, John. Thank you, Silas, for being here, being our guest today. Thank you for everyone who continues to show up, and thank you for those who showed up for the first time today. We invite you to come back and to tell a friend and have them come as well. And as always, we remind you to connect with people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, right? And so that we can, come together in the spirit of unity. Remember that we are all in this together, and that it will take all of us working together to create a world that works for everyone. Have a fantastic week, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. God bless.